Okay, this is chapter 21, and in this lecture, in this video, I'm going to talk about the lymphatic system. It is your responsibility to go and read the entire chapter 21, but I'm going to talk about the lymphatic system in this video and maybe do another short video talking about the immune system as well. So the body has more than 10 times, or at least 10 times, as many bacterial cells as human cells. Some are beneficial. Probably heard about your good gut bacteria. And some are potentially disease-causing. We also harbor E. coli, which can cause disease when it's not working inside of our bodies properly. Some E. coli strains can make us sick. The immune system is not an organ system, but it's a functional system. So if I were to ask you what's the difference between an organ system would be like the cardiovascular system that has the heart, the blood vessels, structure. But the immune system and the lymphatic system, the immune system itself has more, it's more of a function than any one organ type. So we'll talk more about that. So part of the immune system is the lymphatic system. And we're going to talk about the structure and function of the lymphatic system and the organs that are contained in it. The lymphatic system is basically a system that recovers fluid. So as blood circulates throughout the body, some of the fluid in the blood is lost to the tissues, and that fluid has to be recovered to help maintain blood pressure and stabilize and maintain homeostasis. And the lymphatic system does that for us. In the process, it actually aids the immune system in sampling all the things that are going on in the tissue. And so if there's some type of infection or disease state, the lymphatic fluid can alert the immune system that there's something that needs to be paid attention to. So it activates immune responses as well as inspects for disease. And then it returns the excess fluid from the tissue back into the venous system or into the bloodstream. So some of the cells of the lymphatic system, and these are also cells of the immune system, primarily. So we talked about lymphocytes. Here's a lymphocyte in this picture. We talked about that when we talked about the different cell types in blood. Remember, lymphocyte is a white blood cell. So we're going to talk about this lymphatic system first. So we're going to talk about the functions of the lymphatic system, how lymph forms and is returned to the bloodstream, the major cells of the lymphatic system and their functions, and name and describe lymphatic tissue, the different types, describe the structure and function of red bone marrow, the thymus, lymph nodes, tonsil, and spleen. So the main function of the lymphatic system is this fluid recovery. So as fluid filters from the capillaries into the tissue spaces, 85% is reabsorbed, but 15%, which ends up being 2 to 4 liters a day, is returned to the blood system via the lymphatic system. So in the process of this, the fluid picks up foreign cells and chemicals from the tissue, and as it passes through these lymph nodes, immune cells can sample them and see if they're cells that should be in the body or should not be in the body, and whether or not they need to mount an immune response. Also, the lymphatic system is important in lipid absorption. So fats in our diet that are absorbed in the intestine are not actually absorbed through by blood capillaries, but they're by these lacteals, and we'll talk more about those. So lymph, when we talk about lymph, this is that excess fluid, and this fluid comes from the blood. So it's just excess fluid that leaks out into the tissues from the blood, and we'll talk about how that happens. Lymphatic vessels, these are vessels very similar to veins and arteries. that actually transport this lymph. They have their own vessel system, and we'll look at how they're made. They're a little different. They have some differences, but they have a lot of similarities as well. There are different lymphatic tissues that are composed of aggregates of lymphocytes and macrophages, which are those white blood cells that we talked about when we talked about the blood. And some basically stay in the organs of the body to surveil or to kind of make sure that everything's going okay. And then lymphatic organs, these are where these defense cells are concentrated. And we'll talk about what those are and how they work as well. And they're separated by connective tissue or capsules. So lymph, talking about lymph itself, is a colorless fluid similar to plasma, but it has less protein. It originates in the extracellular fluid drawn into the lymphatic capillaries. So this is the excess fluid that's leaked into the tissue, now is drawn into these lymphatic capillaries. The chemical composition varies, depends on where it is, whether it's in the intestines or has it gone through the lymph nodes, what may be still in it. So lymphatic vessels include capillaries, which are the terminal ends of the lymphatics. So this is where you will start. These penetrate every tissue of the body. They are absent from cartilage, cornea, bone, and bone marrow. But the capillary wall is made of endothelial cells that overlap each other like roof shingles. But they are closed at one end. That's one of the differences between the lymphatic vessels and the arteries and veins. The lymphatic vessels are closed at one end, so they only move fluid in one direction. The cells are tethered to surrounding tissue by protein filaments, and there are gaps between these cells that allow bacteria and other cells to enter the lymphatic capillary. The endothelium creates valve-like flaps that open when the interstitial fluid pressure is high and close when it is low. All right, so here's showing a picture. So in our conventional pictures, remember red usually signifies the arteriole, blue the venule. So this is carrying the oxygenated blood, this is carrying deoxygenated blood. And the green is showing the lymphatic vessels. These are the vessels that are picking up this excess fluid that has leaked out of the venous system so it can return this to the venous system. We'll talk about how that happens. So you can see these vessels are basically intertwined with these capillaries. They're all throughout the tissue as well, so they can pick up that excess fluid. And you can see that as this fluid goes in, it starts to move through these vessels in various ways. And we'll talk more about how that works. When we look up close at these lymphatic vesicles, you can see these vessels, you can see how they have this like valve-like structure like we saw in the veins. And this is going to allow the fluid to be pushed up in one direction. And here you see the closed end. Like we don't see this in arteries or veins where it has a closed end, but lymphatic vessels have a closed terminal end here. And then these endothelial cells, you can see how they're overlapping here, and that's going to allow for the fluid to return to the, to go into the lymphatic system. All right, so the large lymphatic vessels, they also have a tunica interna, which is in endothelium and valves. It has a tunica media, which is the elastic fibers and smooth muscles, very similar to arteries and veins, and then a tunica externa, which is a thin outer layer. They converge into larger and larger vessels. So they start with the small capillaries and then they get bigger and bigger as they go back up towards returning this fluid to the venous system. Collecting vessels course through many lymph nodes in the process. All right, so here you can see in this actual stain, you can see one of these valves inside the lymphatic vessels. And here you can see how it's basically pushing the fluid in one direction. It goes from small vesicles into very large vessels. So there's 6 lymphatic trunks, which drain the major portion of the body. You have your jugular, subclavian, bronchiomediastinal, intercostal, intestinal, and lumbar trunks of lymphatic vesicles. So there are 2 collecting ducts. You have your right lymphatic duct. This receives lymph from the right arm, the right side of the head, and the thorax, and it empties into the right subclavian vein. Your thoracic duct, this is larger and longer, and it begins as a sac in the abdomen called the cisternae chyli, and it receives lymph from below the diaphragm, the left arm, the left side of the head and neck, and the thorax, and it empties into the left subclavian vein. And so the subclavian veins collect from the thoracic duct. All right, so here we're showing that thoracic duct. All right, this is the lymphatic. Here you can see that cisternae chyli, this place where it all pools. Here in these pictures, so here we have showing the circulatory system, right? Here you have the pulmonary circuit versus the systemic circuit, right? We talked about this goes to the body, this goes to the lungs. And so all intertwined with the blood vessels, you also have these lymphatic vessels as well. And so as blood leaks out into these areas, as the fluid leaks out of the blood into these areas, it is returned to the venous system. Anything from the right side, head and neck, they all pool into the collecting ducts here. And then things that come from the lower parts of the body, they come up and pool here. And so this is what this is demonstrating. So here you can see on this guy, they're showing all the lymphatic vessels, and you can see all these little nodes. These are going to be your lymph nodes. This is that cisternae chyli, and actually half people don't have it. Only 50%, about 50% of people have a cisternae chyli. Some people don't have this structure at all, but they still function just fine. And so you can see all the different areas, how the lymphatics basically innervate the entire body so that it can take that excess fluid that has drained out of or has come out of the blood back to the venous system. All right, so here you can see here's that right lymphatic duct that basically pools into the right subclavian vein. You can see all these different lymph nodes here. All right, so here's another picture showing that. You can see you have lymphatic vessels that come from the head here, and all the ones that are on the right side, they pool into the right subclavian veins. The ones on the left pool into the left subclavian vein, and here's the one coming up from the below the diaphragm. After it passes the cisternae chyli, will come up and then pool into the left subclavian vein. All right, so fluid and the lymph that flows, it basically flows just like venous return to the body, except there's no pump. The pump is the one for the vein, right? It's through the heart beating that keeps the cardiovascular circuit going. But lymph flows at low pressure and slower speed than venous blood, and it moves along with the rhythmic contractions of the lymphatic vessels. So there's stretching of the vessels basically stimulates them to contract and push the fluid towards the subclavian vein. So there is a skeletal muscle pump. So you have arterial pulsation from the arteries, right, as the heart beats. They squeeze the lymphatic vessels. And this thoracic pump aids in the flow from the abdomen to the thoracic cavity. And the valves help prevent the backflow. So remember the lymphatic vessels have those valves. So rapidly flowing blood into the subclavian vein draws the lymph into it. And so exercise significantly increases lymphatic return. All right, so now talking about the different cell types that you would see in the lymphatic system. So natural killer cells, these are NK cells. They're basically large lymphocytes. They attack and destroy bacteria. Transplanted tissue, so if tissue is not, if tissue comes from a different source other than self, these natural killer cells will attack it. Host cells infected with viruses, so if your cell gets infected with the viruses, the natural killer cells will try and remove that. Or cells that have turned cancerous, that are dividing out of control, will also be attacked by natural killer cells. T lymphocytes or T cells, these are immune cells that mature in the thymus, and we'll talk more about those shortly. B lymphocytes, these are B cells. These activate and cause the proliferation, which means dividing, and differentiation into plasma cells that produce antibodies. So these cells are cells that make the antibodies, so they are immune cells as well. Macrophages, these are large phagocytic cells that in the connective tissue. So once a lymphocyte moves into tissue, it's then called a macrophage. Or a monocyte, once a monocyte moves into tissue, it's called a macrophage. They phagocytose debris, dead neutrophils, bacteria, and other foreign matter. They process foreign material and display antigen fragments to T cells. So this is antigen presentation, and we'll talk about what antigen presentation is when we get to the immune system. All right, so here's showing a macrophage trying to attack several types or several bacteria, and so it's going to try and bring them in and phagocytose them and kill them. All right, dendritic cells. These are branched mobile antigen presenting cells found in the epidermis, right? The mucous membranes and lymphatic organs. They alert the immune system to pathogens that have gotten into the body. Reticular cells, these are stationary cells that contribute to the stroma of the lymphatic organ. I'll show you a picture of what that looks like. Lymphatic tissue or lymphoid tissue, you might see either term, lymphatic or lymphoid, talking about the same thing. And these are aggregations of lymphocytes in the connective tissue of the mucous membranes and various organs. And we'll look at some of this lymphoid tissue. Diffuse lymphatic tissue, this is the simplest form where lymphocytes are just scattered, they're not clustered. And this is in any of those openings to the body. So respiratory, digestive, urinary, reproductive tracts. And they're called, they also usually have, are called MALT tissue, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, MALT. So you have lymphatic nodules or follicles, or these are the lymph nodes. They're dense masses of lymphocytes and macrophages that congregate in response to a pathogen. They're a constant feature of the lymph nodes, tonsils, and appendix. So these follicles of the lymph nodes, and we'll look at what a lymph node looks like. Aggregated lymph node nodules are these dense clusters in the ileum and distal portions of the small intestine. So we'll look at those as well. So here's showing a lymph nodule off the intestine here in an H&E stain. Here you can see Peyer's patches. We'll come back to what those are, but they're basically a lymph tissue that are in the intestines as well. All right. So when we look at the lymphatic organs, what they actually look like, how they're made, they have connective tissue capsule that separates the lymphatic tissue from neighboring tissue. So they have a capsule around them. And so the primary lymphatic organs are red bone marrow and the thymus, right? So where we get T cells from, thymus, T cells. And the bone marrow is where we get the B cells from. So B for bone marrow, T for thymus. And they are where these cells become what's called immunocompetent. And this means they're able to recognize and respond to different antigens or things that are presented to them. Secondary lymphatic organs, these are the lymph nodes, tonsils, and spleen. Their immunocompetent cells populate tissue. Immunocompetent cells populate these tissues, and we'll talk about how that works. All right, so primary organs are the bone marrow and thymus, secondary lymph node, tonsil, spleen. Now, primary organ, the red bone marrow, is involved in hemopoiesis, right? This is where our blood cells are formed. But it also is important for immunity. It's also where the white blood cells are formed. So this is, it's soft, loosely organized, but highly vascularized. It's separated from the bone tissue by endosteum or bone. And as these blood cells mature, they push their way through the reticular and endothelial cells to enter the sinus and flow away in the bloodstream. All right, so here's a picture. We're looking at the epiphysis of the femur here, and you can see here you have the sinusoids of where the bone marrow is. We're looking at the bone marrow. You have some adipose cells as well, and these sinusoids are little open spaces. Remember, sinuses are open spaces. There's a capillary here with blood cells coming in, and here you see as these cells are maturing, they just push their way through these endothelial cells at the end here and just go into the bloodstream. All right, and so that's how those work. Now the thymus, this is also a primary lymphatic organ, and it's also a member of the endocrine system. If you remember what hormones the thymus makes, thymosin, thymopoietin, those type things, and it's part of the immune system as well. So it houses developing lymphocytes. All right, that's going to be its immune function, secretes hormones regulating their activity. That's its endocrine function. And then it's a bilobal organ located in the superior mediastinum between the sternum and the aorta. This is that organ that sits like right on top of the heart. And it degenerates with age. It's usually most functional till about your teen years, till about 12, 13. All right, so here's showing where the thymus sits right on top of the heart there. So it has a fibrous capsule, and from that it has trabeculae or septa that divide the gland into several lobes, and we'll look at it in a picture in a moment. The lobes have a cortex and a medulla. Remember, I told you this is a term we'll see over and over again. Cortex is the outer portion, medulla is the inner portion. And the medulla is the part that's populated with the T lymphocytes. Epithelial cells seal off the cortex from the medulla, forming the blood-thymus barrier. And this produces signals, molecules for the thymosin, thymopoietin, and thymulin, and interleukins and interferons. All right, so here's showing a picture of the thymus. And here you can see how it has all these cells. It has a cortical part that has all these cells, and then it has the medulla, the inner portion, which has a different group of cells. It has the dendritic cells and the epithelial cells, the medullary, and these thymic corpuscles. So here's showing a stain of that thymus. You can see the different lobes, right, in that part. All right, here's some other pictures just showing you the lobes, the septa, and the cortex versus the medulla. Here you can see some of these corpuscles that are also in the thymus. All right, lymph nodes. These are the most numerous lymphatic organs. There are hundreds of lymph nodes throughout the body. Several have two functions. They serve two functions. They cleanse the lymph, and then they act as a site of T and B cell activation. They're elongated bean-shaped structures with a hilum. And a hilum is just an area where blood vessels come in. And we'll look at that again. We'll see hilum again when we look at the kidney and when we look at the lungs. It's an area where blood and nerves go into the organ. Enclosed with the fibrous capsule and a trabeculae that divide the interior into compartments, and then the stroma of reticular fibers and reticular cells. Those. All right, so here's showing the cortex, the outer portion, then the medulla is the inner portion. And this looks very similar to what a kidney looks like, and we'll look at that as well. Now, the difference is lymphatic vesicle has these germination centers, and we'll talk about what those are as well. All right, so here's just showing again the different structures. Let you look at that on your own time. Some more medium magnification. Still looking at the lymph node, lymph node, lymph node. All right. So the parenchyma is divided into cortex and medulla, and parenchyma is just the inner portion of the lymph node. It has germinal centers where the B cells multiply and differentiate into plasma cells, and plasma cells are the ones that make antibody. There are several afferent lymphatic vessels, and these lead into the node. So afferent means towards the node. Sorry, go back. Into its convex surface, and we'll look at that in a moment. And then lymph leads the node through 3 efferent lymphatic vessels that leave the hilum. And that's where those blood vessels and nerves come in. All right, so here's a picture showing a lymph node. You can see it. We haven't done the kidney yet, but when we look at the kidney, it'll look similar. The only difference is the kidney doesn't have all these afferent enterings into the kidney, but we'll look at that soon. But you see, you have all these afferent vessels that go into the kidney, so they're bringing fluid into the kidney, but you only have one coming out, and this is structure following function. This allows for fluid to come in, but it has to take time to go out because there's only one poured out. It takes time, and it has to go through the lymph node, and it's basically screened while it's in there. So when you blow up these areas of the lymph node, you can see how cellular it is. And then when you blow up even this area, you can see how those reticular fibers, so remember what reticular fibers look like from your histology. It also has these lymphocytes that live in this reticular tissue. So as this fluid is going through the lymph node, it is sampling what's in there. These cells can see if they're bacteria or other cells that are abnormal that need to be removed, and it basically can kind of keep an eye on what's going on in the fluid that's coming from that particular area of the body. And by having so many lymph nodes in so many different places, if these lymph nodes start to proliferate and get larger or swell, that's why they usually palpitate. They try and feel your lymph nodes when you go to the doctor, because if they're swollen, that indicates that there's possibly an infection in your body. All right, so cervical lymph nodes, these are the ones in the neck, and this is the one they usually feel. You definitely have them feel for when you go to the doctor, and they monitor the lymph coming from the head and neck. Axillary lymph nodes, these are concentrated in the armpit. Sometimes if you've ever gotten an infection, you might feel that those get kind of swollen. They may even be sore. And they receive lymph from the upper limb and the female breast. And then thoracic lymph nodes, these are embedded in the mediastinum, and they receive lymph from the mediastinum, the lungs, and the airways. All right, so here's showing those mediastinal lymph nodes. The abdominal lymph nodes, these occur in the abdominal pelvic wall, and they monitor lymph from the urinary and reproductive systems. So depending on where a lymph node is swollen or engorged, you can kind of know where to look for an infection, right? Intestinal and mesenteric lymph nodes, these are found in the mesenteries adjacent to the appendix and the intestines, and they basically monitor the lymph from the digestive tract. Then you have inguinal lymph nodes, and these are in the groin, and they receive lymph from the lower limbs. Popliteal lymph nodes, these occur in the back of the knee, and they receive the lymph from the leg proper. All right, so here's showing the mediastinal, axillary in the armpit, inguinal in the groin, and the iliac nodes. right? Here you can see this is the large intestine, right? And you can see how they have lymph nodes all throughout the mesentery here. Okay. All right, and here's just showing another picture in a cadaver. So when lymph nodes are challenged by an antigen or there's some type of infection, you get lymphadenitis. And this is swollen, painful lymph nodes responding to the foreign antigen. So those cells in there start to divide and they bring in all these chemicals that basically stimulate your pain receptors. You can have a lymphadenectomy, or you can have lymphadenopathy, which is just any disease. Lymphopathy means disease of the lymph nodes. Now, metastasis, right? We know that's when cancerous cells move from their point of origin throughout the body. And lymph nodes are often tested to see if a cancer cell has metastasized, because these cells usually will enter a lymphatic vessel and enlarge in those reticular fibers, and even multiply there and can destroy the lymph nodes. So swollen or firm, but usually painless, is when you had metastasis of a cancer to the lymph nodes, and then it'll tend to spread from the next node downstream. Breast cancer is one of those cancers that metastasize very readily, and so usually they'll have a mastectomy or lumpectomy, and they'll also remove any nearby lymph nodes as well. Okay, so here's showing those axillary lymph nodes that are very close to the breast, and these are the ones that usually get removed if someone has breast cancer. So another lymphatic organ is the tonsils, and they're patches of lymphatic tissue, and they're located at the entrance of the pharynx. Some of you may have even had yours removed already. They guard against ingested or inhaled pathogens, and they're covered with epithelium, and they have deep pits in them, and these are called tonsillar crypts that line the lymphatic nodules. Tonsillitis is when you have an infection and they get swollen, and then you may have a tonsillectomy where they're removed. There are three main sets of tonsils. You have your palatine tonsils, and these are at the posterior margin of the oral cavity, and these are most often the ones that are infected and removed. You have lingual tonsils. These are at the root of the tongue, and then pharyngeal tonsils, or the adenoids. And these are a single tonsil in the wall of the nasal pharynx, adenoids. All right, so here's a picture showing your palatine tonsil there. So think of your palate. That's what I think. Then lingual is your tongue. At the base of the tongue, there's the lingual tonsil. And then pharyngeal is up here, kind of where your ear meets your throat. It's the pharyngeal tonsil. All right. Here's showing a picture of what a lymph node or the tonsil will look like. And here you can see these crypts where they have these spaces where things, if they get in there, they can be sampled, and you have these lymphatic nodules with lymphatic tissue. All right. All right, so here's just some more histology showing those things. All right. Here's showing the tonsils, palatine, pharyngeal, and lingual. All right. All right, spleen. This is the largest lymphatic organ. It has a parenchyma of two types of tissue. It has red pulp and it has white pulp. So the red pulp is filled with erythrocytes, imagine that, which are red blood cells. And the white pulp is filled with lymphocytes, macrophages, which are the white cells, surrounded by small branches of the splenic artery. All right. So here's showing the spleen. Right, it's up kind of in the corner, and in our models, it's up in the little corner there, the spleen. The functions of the spleen are red blood cells. They come and go through the spleen, but old fragile red blood cells are removed here in the spleen. So this is why it's called the erythrocyte graveyard or red blood cell graveyard. Blood cell production in the fetus and anemic adults also happens in the spleen. The white pulp monitors blood for foreign antigens, members the white blood cells, and keeps an army of monocytes for release when needed. So it also stores monocytes for further use. Stabilizes blood volume through plasma transfers to the lymphatic system. The spleen is highly vascular and vulnerable to trauma and infection. So a ruptured spleen requires the removal, which leaves the person susceptible to future infections and premature death. All right, so here's showing a picture of the spleen and a cadaver here. Here's a cartoon showing how the arteries and veins are in the spleen, and you can see the hilum, right, is where those arteries and veins go into the spleen. So the spleen has a hilum as well. And then here you can see the white pulp versus the red pulp. So it actually looks more red with the red blood cells. And then the white pulp is the other. You can really just see the nuclei. All right, so here's again red pulp versus white pulp. It's mostly red pulp, but there are these patches of white pulp. All right, here's more of the spleen, more of the spleen, more of the spleen. All right, so I'm going to stop here on the lymphatic system, and I will do a separate video for the immune system.